This is the start of the year. There's everything out there. There's so much disinformation. There's so much that needs to be filtered. People don't know what matters, what doesn't. And we're trying to create an organizing principle that allows you to make sense of it, a roadmap for the year, if you will. I'm Ian Bremmer. I'm a political scientist and president of Eurasia Group. We've been writing this top risk report for, I want to say, 15 or 16 years now. And a couple of reasons for it. The first is really to set out in a disciplined way how we're thinking about the biggest concerns and some opportunities in the coming year, in a way that we can then come back and say, well, we're going to have to do this. We're going to have to do this. And we're going to have to do this. And the portrait of Eurasia is going to be digitalized effects, images, ones that will do it for us, that we all spend way too much time with on a day-to-day basis. And we're trying to create an organizing principle that allows you to make sense of it, a roadmap for the year, if you will. For this year, I go back to our report back in 2012 when we talked about a gazero world. When we first talked about this idea that the balance of power in the world had shifted dramatically, away from the institutions and the architecture that was meant to provide some governance and leadership, and that reality meant that we were no longer going to have the United States acting as the global policeman or the architect of global trade or the cheerleader for global values, and that no other country or group of countries were going to be able or willing to fill that gap, that void. So this was a period that was coming of geopolitical recession, and it would lead to a lot of conflict. It would lead to a power vacuum. It would lead to the erosion of a lot of the institutions that we had sort of almost taken for granted as we came of age. Now that was 12 years ago. It takes a while for these mechanisms to really play out over the course of a decade. And I think that's what's happening. And I think that's what's happening in the course of a global order. That's really what I was thinking of as we were writing the 2024 top risks. We are now in the teeth of the G0. We're in the teeth of a geopolitical recession. And there are major wars and confrontation with no prospects for an effective response, for containment, for useful diplomacy. And indeed, the adversary, the economic adversary in these conflicts don't even share the same basic set of understanding of what they're fighting over, the same basic facts. They say, you're entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. Well, whoever said that wasn't looking at the geopolitical order in 2024. Everyone thinks they're entitled to their own facts. And that makes it much, much harder to effectively address these risks over the course of the year. The number 10 risk is risky business. It is about culture wars from both left and right. Cancel culture from left and right, making it much more difficult for companies that have exposure to the US market to do effective business. In both red and blue environments, red and blue states, red and blue constituencies. It's if you're a corporation, you don't want to do it. You don't want to do it. You want to spend a lot of time thinking about your political orientation. You want to work with clients and with customers and with employees across the political spectrum. You just want to hire the best people you can find, and you want to sell into the customer networks that are most interested in buying your product, whatever it is. We are in a political environment in the United States where that is becoming increasingly hard to do. Whether you are the CEO, whether you're the CEO of a company, whether you're the CEO of a Fortune 500 corporation or the investor of a major portfolio, or you're the president of an American university, it's just really hard to satisfy these varied constituents. And that is going to get harder, not easier, especially in an election year in 2024. The number 9 risk is El Nino is back. El Nino is irregular. It's a very regular occurrence, but now its regularity is occurring. Against the backdrop of climate change and global warming, which makes it more dangerous. The stresses that come, especially in countries and regions that cannot afford to respond. On the back of massive fiscal outlays and debt with higher interest payments. It makes it really difficult to deal with a sudden, unexpected climate stress. On the right, if you want sort of if getting the full meat, or a much larger package of a super bizarre, but not super known crisis problem. At length, this sickie that I know is going to destroy a healthy environment and its communities. And then as you get more numbers of cons, shaky target figures will grow. Going to become even more. So I've got some thinking on where we fall in hierarchical, create, and therefore the market as a whole has to leave simply. But the trend is going to be 4 months from now. That's what's going to happen. And so therefore, there needs to be money set aside, infrastructure capacity built. And as we saw in the COP28 summit in the Emirates, there needs to be a loss and damages fund, which finally the world's countries have agreed to, but they've put virtually no money into it. It's not just a matter of, yeah, we agree we need one. It has to actually have resources behind it. A little bit like we discussed with water stress in 2023, where people continue to say, well, you've got a major drought, or you've got massive flooding, and we need to respond to that, like after the fact in that place. This is something that is going to be an increasing global phenomenon. That is part of our global risk environment, has to be addressed as such. The number 8 risk is no room for error. And this fundamentally talks about the global inflation shock that began in 2021. There was some optimism in 2023 that it was coming down significantly, and indeed in many countries. Faster than had been expected as the world was coming out of the COVID lockdowns. 2024 is about that inflation being persistent, in part responding to really challenging geopolitical environment. In part responding to greater dislocations in the marketplace. From subsidies and industrial, policy and nationalism that makes globalization at its max, at its peak efficiency, harder to operationalize. And also just that central bankers have very little margin for making mistakes. So their ability to come down in interest rates as fast as the markets are expecting at the beginning of 2024 seems very, very unlikely. Market stocks right now in the United States are priced for perfection. Pretty much everything has to go right in order to meet that soft landing. We don't expect a recession in the United States, but we do expect underperformance. That means that it's going to be a challenge for Biden in 2024, who's kind of counting on this is going to be a good economic story. It's one of the reasons that he has to pivot towards talking about democracy. We'll get to that in a bit. In the United Kingdom, it means the Labour Party is much more likely to get an absolute majority, and taking out soon for risk number 7 is the fight for critical minerals. And we are seeing as the world transitions away from fossil fuels to post-carbon energy and infrastructure and the related supply chain, that there are huge opportunities for the countries that have invested in those technologies, like China heavily, as well as have availability of these critical minerals across the global south. And that creates political opportunities for disruption that are going to play out over the course of this year. A couple ways it will have an impact. One is that as the Chinese are facing a hard time from the US and its allies on export controls for semiconductors and cloud computing, where they don't have the technology, the response will be licensing regimes and export controls around those technologies. That the Chinese dominate, particularly those that involve electric vehicles, batteries. And that supply chain, where the Chinese are really a global superpower. Secondly, if you are a sub-Saharan African or Latin American country with lots and lots of critical minerals that everybody wants access to, you are putting policies in place that are requiring a lot more domestic investment to help your development of new technologies. Getting up the value chain, which makes a lot of sense for you, but also increases the expense of getting this stuff out of the ground. And that's something that we're going to see for critical minerals across the board. Whether it's lithium, or it's graphite, or it's uranium for that matter. And then, of course, you also have the developed countries who are looking at carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And that's going to hurt developing countries who have a hard time stripping carbon out of their supply chains and exports. But the Europeans in particular saying, no, 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 we want to move faster and faster towards this transition. Well, easier for them to do that. They're wealthy. They can afford those compromises. Very hard to do if you're a country like India, if you're a country like Brazil. So all of that is playing out in 2024. Verse number 6 is no China recovery. A big piece of this is directly political. The fact that Xi Jinping has consolidated an enormous amount of power, and his personal inclination is to focus on national security and political stability at the expense of economic growth. And that means that as China is facing significant structural slowdown in their economy, his response is incremental. It is at the margins.